PhD candidate in data science at the University of Oxford and current member of the technical staff at the AI Safety Institute here in the UK. Kobi, thank you so much for joining me. You can certainly speak to your background and experience better than I can, so I'll pass it to you for a quick introduction of yourself, and then we can jump into discussing the research that you performed using Prolific in your time at the Alan Turing Institute.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for having me, Brock. Excited to talk about some of the research. By way of brief introduction, yeah, as you mentioned, I'm a PhD candidate at Oxford currently. And yeah, working a lot on understanding the ways in which AI systems influence human behaviors, attitudes, and cognition. So this looks at both models and humans, and sort of tries to understand the ways in which they can influence one another. So yeah, that's sort of the subject of the research we'll be discussing today, and excited to get into it more.
Amazing. Thanks, Kobi. Well, I mentioned this was in your time at the Alan Turing Institute. I guess if you could just give a quick overview of the research that you performed and I suppose the outcome that you were looking to achieve.
Yeah, sure. So in this particular project, well, let me first give some context. So as these recent times have seen sort of a rapid advance in the capabilities of large AI language models, these generative language models like ChatGPT is the most famous one. And as the sort of text generated by these models becomes more compelling and more human-like, concerns have been raised that this could cause issues for the political process, wherein certain actors would co-opt these models and use them to generate large amounts of very compelling political texts. And if these texts were able to influence human attitudes, this could cause problems for politics, whereby voter autonomy would be challenged, essentially. And so recently, a lot of the work I've been doing is looking at measuring how persuasive is the text created by these language models. And so with that sort of as a general motivation, with this particular paper, we were looking at trying to understand the relationship between the size of a model and how persuasive a model is on political issues. And so in particular here in this study, we had models of multiple different sizes. Each generates a set of persuasive messages, and then we deployed these messages onto the Prolific pool of participants. And so we're really looking to see is the persuasiveness of a language model something that increases very rapidly as it grows bigger? Is this something that's maybe like growing exponentially, for example? Or is it something that's sort of like linearly progressing? Or is it, on the contrary, something that faces sharply diminishing returns? And this, as a large language model grows larger, there are diminishing returns to the persuasiveness of the messages it generates on political issues.
Gotcha. That makes sense. And can you go a little bit more into detail about the task that participants were taking part in?
Sure. So participants were given a 8 to 12 sentence message that had been generated by a language model ranging in size from 70 million parameters to 72 billion parameters, and then some frontier models like GPT-4 and Claude. And these messages were essentially just static vignettes that were offering facts, maybe evidence, maybe moral reasons why a particular political issue stance, like say privatizing healthcare for veterans or abolishing the Electoral College, maybe is or isn't a good idea. And so then we would measure their attitudes after reading the message and compare them to a control group who read no message. And this is how we were sort of able to estimate the persuasive effect of these messages.
That makes sense. And going into, I guess, more specifically, the audience that you were looking to target, I know that the quantity of submissions that you were looking for was quite large, ended up surpassing 25,000 unique individual submissions from US residents. Can you talk me through how that quantity was selected and why that number is significant for this research?
Yeah, sure. So basically, it's a very difficult and costly sort of research question because In order to get a robust measure of persuasiveness, you of course want many different issues. And of course, in order to plot a curve, of a scaling curve of how persuasiveness increases as a function of size, you obviously need many models or many data points along that curve. And of course, to get a precise estimate for each issue for each model, you need, a significant quantity of participants to get like a precise estimate. And so all together, this just resulted in a design where we needed a very large number of participants. And being able to hit that number is important because there are certain statistical thresholds. It's called statistical power, basically, where if you don't have a certain amount of observations, you're no longer able to confidently say that you can show with your data that you can predict an effect size, we call it, a persuasive effect in this case, of a particular size. And so that's a complicated way of saying if we didn't hit that number, then the results wouldn't be statistically valid.
Got it. That makes sense. And luckily we were able to get there, which is amazing, and glad that we could help support that. I guess I'm curious what the overall findings were, any like key takeaways, and I suppose how that maybe aligns with your expectations going into the project.
Yeah, sure. So as I alluded to before, I think the top line finding was that there were diminishing returns. So we saw that sort of as we got closer to these frontier models, these very, very large models, the marginal increase from increasing the size of the model was smaller and smaller. Was this what we expected going in? I think broadly, yes, right? I think intuitively in this project, we were looking at static messages. So again, just like eight sentence messages. It seems like intuitively there shouldn't be like an infinite there should be a ceiling, right, on how persuasive these short messages can be, right? You wouldn't really expect that there's some like magical way that a model could make like an 8-sentence message just so persuasive that it's just like completely changing your mind on every issue that you give it. So to that sense, I think it was something that myself and the other co-authors were broadly expecting. But it's important to note that these sorts of relationships might be different for a more prolonged like multi-turn dialogue, where the model does have more room to like really like adapt to participants' responses and maybe employ like more advanced persuasion strategies.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's what I was going to sort of lead into, is more of a conversational model might, you feel, have more of a persuasive effect as opposed to these types of just, shorter outputs.
That would be my hunch. I mean, we shouldn't take my word for it, and we're working on some research in that vein, so we'll know soon. But yeah, I'd expect that while you might still see a diminishing returns sort of curve, the larger models might like start to push an advantage compared to the smaller models, because the task is basically, it seems plausible that they have these like really large models have sort of persuasive capabilities that we weren't able to elicit in just a brief like 200-word message.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess ultimately, like, how do you feel, as someone who is now at the AI Safety Institute, we are in this political cycle in the US. Like, how do you think this knowledge can be applied either, by AI modelers or by end users of AI? Like, I'm curious, how this can sort of be applied broadly.
Yeah, well, so I think obviously this year has been a huge election year, right? So people were really concerned since this election year was coinciding with this like AI boom, about the, I think understandably about the ways that AI could be used to influence political outcomes and the way campaigns could use them now. And as these, labs keep like releasing newer, larger models, people are like concerned about the trajectory, like where is this headed? And so I think in the case of this paper, rather than being like directly applied, it's more a case of understanding sort of what the landscape will look like moving forward. And sort of being able to maybe have some confidence that like, okay, these static AI generated messages are persuasive. Certainly they are persuasive, but this persuasiveness isn't scaling to infinity to the point where 2026 midterms, we're just going to have mind controlling AI bots just like running around on Twitter. So personally, that would be my sort of takeaway. But again, it's difficult as the field progresses rapidly. Like, this won't be the last time that someone has to do a study like this. The technology will continue to advance and evolve, and so this isn't the end of the story.
Yeah, seems very much like the beginning, which maybe gives you the opportunity to continue doing this yourself in the future, which we can get into a bit later on what you have coming up. But I suppose moving more into the Prolific experience, right? I know you had used Prolific prior to this project, but can you talk me through like how you decided to use Prolific for this research?
Yeah, sure. So a lot of the work I do, it's important that the participants are reading the message and engaged in the task, right? Because it's very easy for someone who's just clicking through a study like this to basically just pollute the data with noise and basically obfuscate, persuasive effects that do exist and capabilities that are there in these models. So for that reason, it's very important that the participants are of a high quality, essentially. And I found that in my research, and I think this has been shown empirically, that the Prolific participants tend to be, more engaged than many other platforms. And so for me, that's the biggest reason why I would choose Prolific.
Gotcha. And I suppose, how specifically did you use and work with the Prolific platform throughout this process?
Could you say what you mean by that exactly?
Yeah, I suppose in terms of study design and targeting audiences and things of that nature, like anything that stands out, I suppose, with how you were using Prolific that maybe was helpful throughout the process.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I appreciate the interface that Prolific has for monitoring data collection in real time. That's helpful. In terms of targeting and pre-screening, I think we didn't really do that much because the sample size was so large. It sort of prohibits granularity or scaling certain representational criteria. But yeah, and I think in general, I just found it really useful to be able to monitor what was going on in real time through the sort of Prolific interface. Yeah.
And I guess comparing, that experience to maybe other tools that you've used, does anything stand out, I suppose, as being maybe, more beneficial through Prolific? Any particular aspect of the service that you found, made the research more possible than it maybe would have been through other suppliers?
I mean, I think in this case, obviously the scale was a concern. And so it was really great that we were able to hit that number and sort of get to the number of participants we needed. And I'm sure many of smaller providers wouldn't have been able to hit that number. So I just think that capacity and sort of the depth of the network that Prolific has in this case was really useful.
Cool. Amazing. Great. Well, this is something that we always sort of ask at the end of these conversations, is if you're able to just summarize your experience working with Prolific, that would be sort of interesting to hear.
Yeah, sure. I think I was obviously it's never easy, conducting research on this scale, and problems always arise. And so I think it was really great to know that there was people on the Prolific side who are willing to work through the inevitable difficulties and challenges and just sort of make sure the project got finished on time and ended up being executed correctly. And so I think, from this project, at least, that's what stands out in my mind as what it was like to work with Prolific and why I would recommend it to others. But yeah, it was great.
Cool. Well, we'd love to hear that. I guess top of mind for me, you're in a new role. What's next for you? Any future projects that you're able to share with us at this time?
Yeah, so it can't speak to all of them, but I can certainly say, because I've already alluded to it earlier in this conversation, that scaling this research to a multi-turn domain is something that we're working on actively right now. Doing this similar research, but in a sort of more dynamic, prolonged fashion, where participants are going to be able to converse with the models instead of just read previously generated messages. So I think that's something I'm really looking forward to in the near future. But yeah, lots of good stuff coming soon.
Nice. That's amazing. Thanks again, Kobi, for your time. It's been great working with you on this. And yeah, really looking forward to seeing all the great work that you'll continue to do in the world of AI.
Cheers. Yeah, thanks so much, Brock.